It's with a great joy that I join you here in the holy city of Jerusalem, a city that binds Christians and Jews and all kinds of people together in a historical context in which our stories are intertwined, both in the past but also in the future. We are in the land of Moses, Deborah, David, Jeremiah, who all lived in times of great turmoil, just like we do. They showed leadership and faced great personal sacrifice as they chose to speak out and lead the Jewish people in the right direction. Just as history is an onflowing current of events, we are all part of the same story, unfolding yet in another age as Europe today has become one of the most secularized and spiritually antagonistic regions in the world. I am here to speak about how the radical left turned Norway into what today seems to be the most anti-Semitic country in the West, with its which is remarkably bent on being negative towards Israel. And the details are quite astonishing. But let me start by taking a look at the historical processes in Europe that has led to this radical swing of anti-Israelism that Norway is suffering from today. The past 100 years, the atheistic revolt, with its ruthless deconstruction of traditional values and demonstrative push away from religious ideals, has created an ongoing battle to crush the beliefs of, for example, the Christian Church, and thus also reduce the reverence for the dogmatic Jewish prophets like Jeremiah, of whom I just spoke, and also reduce the respect for the Judeo-Christian history of religions as a whole. The eagerness to break down the lessons of history, thinking that every reform automatically leads to the better, has caused Europeans to lose the confidence in the underpinnings of Judeo-Christian culture. When contempt for one's own history is the dominant and politically correct view, it is only natural that a lack of respect for the rich history of the Jews, which is several thousand years old in the Middle East, is going to be part of that picture. The denial of Israel's hereditary rights to the land of David simply reflects how modern leftist voices do not know the history of their own civilization. Amongst many other things, such as the influence on art, architecture, the banking system, the building of the cities in the medieval Europe, the core and founding values of the Western civilization stems directly from the Hebrew faith. The belief in the dignity of the human beings, regardless of rank, class, ethnicity, carries deep impact from Judaism. And the ethics of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not lie, have formed the basis of the creation of stable, democratic European states. Modern European culture found its civilizational peak in the couplings between the Judeo-Christian values or the Judeo-Christian values of the Ten Commandments and the Protestant ethic, joined with capitalism's emphasis, this is around 200 years ago, on hard work, leading to economic gain, and the value of being trustworthy and honest. This produced a leading societal force which made the Western civilization world-leading. Stories of the lives of Moses, David, and Jeremiah have enriched the Western culture for generations and formed the way we view the dignity of the human being and his relationship to God, the Creator. Every Christian loves the Torah indirectly, for this book is the foundation of the values that has formed our culture. As Europeans, we have come to overemphasize the privatization of religion and thereby marginalizing and encaging religion's enthralling ability to turn citizens into morally aware people who voice the need for solidarity and respect for others. But today, even leading neo-atheists like German philosopher Jürgen Habermas speak about the need for renewed respect for religious ethics and morality in order to restore solidarity among Europeans. Since we see that solidarity is withering too quickly in modern secular societies. When he received the Holberg Prize in the beautiful coastal city of Bergen, Norway, in 2005, he held a remarkable speech about his change of heart pertaining to the role of religion. Yet, at the peak of civilizational bliss, Europe decided to move away from the values and set of ideals that once made this culture so great. Just like the Roman Empire and other great civilizations did before them, which made these cultures slowly move into decay. In this picture, the example of Norway is extremely interesting. This is, you may say, a marginalized country in the northern parts of Europe that by luck happened to discover oil in the 1970s. By the 1980s, the benefits from this most lucrative industry flowed into society, giving regular people the feeling of being rich and above the poor and other nations that we felt had dominated us before. Norway got its true independence as late as 1905 and had been dominated by Sweden and Denmark for centuries before. This is a country where we traditionally, and this is deep in the spirit of the Norwegians, we like to be perceived as nice. Not always just, or not always honest, but meek, mild, and sometimes seemingly kind. Norwegian culture has traditionally been consensus-oriented, and naturally when we suddenly became a wealthy oil country, The wish was that this was Norway's moment to shine and through its foreign policy show the world how nice and peaceful we are, and that we also can teach other countries to be nice and peaceful. Of course, the money helped. It's remarkable how many friends money can buy. I know this because I grew up in Africa. Back then, it was most usual that politicians bought their way into positions they otherwise never would have. State money, often expropriated into their own hands. I'm speaking about the Africans. Through pure corruption, was used to buy influence in political sectors or social arenas they otherwise never would be allowed access to. Billions shifted owners by a handshake. And both parties got what they wanted. This small but rich oil country that yearly hosts the highly politicized Nobel Peace Prize is also the country that was torn apart by the terrorist attack last year, which killed 77 people. In a sense, 2011 marks the end of the notion of Norway as a peacefully relaxed place. Ethnic, religious, and social tensions are growing, only partly, because there are many reasons, but partly as a result of the mass immigration from foreign countries the past 20 years. Norwegians are trying to cope with these changes, amongst other the cultural effects of having imported more than 150 Muslims who mainly live in the Oslo area. The terrorist Anders Behring Breivik massacre illustrated, even though he seems to have been acting alone, the deep cultural conflicts that boil right beneath the surface amongst the nice and kind Norwegian people. All Oslo also being rated the drug capital of Europe points together with a number of other social issues to the fact that the measures of the left-wing government the past years have been a failure. Peace is not on everybody's lips in Norway anymore, as we struggle to enter the multiracial, multicultural, and floating world of global diversity without a clear foundation in the traditional values that once made the Norwegian culture so stable and fruitful. The issues in this country is more than what meets the eye. For how can a country that used to be such a steadfast friend of Israel turn into a nation with a government that refuses to renounce Hamas as a terrorist movement? Prior to the Oslo Peace Accord in 1993, Yasser Arafat was required to denounce terrorism. Today, the radical left-wing government silently accepts Hamas' demand for ethnic cleansing of the Jewish minority, while foreign ministers like Jonas Gahr Støre pose no major remark until a late interview in 2011. As if the political pressure was so great that he felt obliged to at least say something. But even then, the talks and support for Hamas continued. Norway has not on any level protested and formed lists of unwanted terrorists, organizations like the US, UN, or the EU. Norway has become a state permeated by an unusually hostile view on Israel. And this is reflected in a multi-level way in society. Let us take a deeper glance at just this and how this was made possible. We know that on the state level, this is very interesting, Norway's taxpayers' money and our highly regarded oil revenues float uncritically by the billions into Gaza as Norway heads the ad hoc liaison committee established after the Oslo Accords in 1993, with the task of mobilizing financial support for a Palestinian state building. Yet, all Jonas Gahr Støre's effort over the past years in favor of the Palestinians have ended in failure. The foreign minister's relentless efforts to shape a region so far from home, the region of the Middle East, reached its final peak in 2011 when Palestinians made their UN bid for recognition of their state only to be stopped by the US. The inescapable conclusion in the aftermath of this was that the AHLC no longer has a role to play in the peace process, and that the strategy to pay money in order to finance the building of a state has failed. Not least because nationhood is something that the nation itself must build. Foreign aid and money given top down, this is not bottom up. It's money given top down often doesn't work as intended, as the case of Africa has clearly shown. It is not surprising that anti-Semitism and hostility towards Israel is a major problem in a country where even on state level there is such a biased and one-sided support only for the Palestinian views of the conflict. It is particularly interesting to take a closer look at the Norwegian trade unions. Since the 1970s, they have strongly supported an organization called the Palestine Committee, Palestina-komiteen in Norwegian, which state that its main goal is to fight Israel's Zionism and views the state of Israel as the main hinder for peace in the Middle East. This particular organization is remarkably well organized, with branches in every part of the country. That has clearly fueled a negative impression on Israel into the whole Norwegian workforce. One of the views impressed into its members and into the trade unions through its many organizations is that there is an ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians done by Israelis and that Norway should boycott Israel. My country is also a nation where a majority of the media now is owned by the labor movement and the left through the A-pressen, the A-press, with articles almost solely portraying Israel in a negative way. It's almost impossible to find articles in major Norwegian newspapers portraying happenings in Israel in a positive way. The labor unions are very strong in Norway. The very wealthy Norwegian trade union LO now owns papers with a daily circulation, and this is an amazing number, of 661,000 newspapers in a country with only close to 5 million people. LO owns 81 of the Norwegian newspapers. 81, according to Dagbladet. In 2011, LO's current leader, Roald Flåten, said that he was very proud of the influence of the left on the media, as no trade union in the whole of Europe controls that many newspapers on our side, he said. Most of the Norwegian labor force are members of LO, the AUF, the youth group of the Arbeiderpartiet, the Labour Party in Norway, who had their annual gathering at Utøya last year when the terrorist Anders Behring Breivik attacked them there. This AUF is also strongly engaged in the work of the Palestine Committee, as well as a large portion of LO's rich member organizations, which all push for the view that Israel is engaged in ethnic cleansing. LO, like a quite big parentheses, is also a main sponsor for the Arbeiderpartiet, the Norwegian Labour Party. The Palestine Committee wants, among other things, is very interesting. This is true. You can just look up on the website, palestinecommittee.no, palestinakomiteen.no. You find all this, just public material. Wants, among other things, that LO stop any affiliation with Israeli Histadrut. This is partly why it's very easy in Norway to see regular people wearing T-shirts saying "Stop Apartheid" in Israel. Chances are this person is engaged in the labor unions and through its work involved in the Palestine Committee. These people will eagerly tell you that Israel is a colonial apartheid project taking place in the wrong century. When do you then add the influence of the biased media, which is largely owned by the left, and see the current government's engagement solely on the Palestinian side, you easily understand some of the reasons why Norway has turned out the way it has. Please keep in mind that in Norway, approximately 50% of the labor workforce work in the public sector, which is controlled by the government, and more than 60% of the values are owned by the state and thus also controlled by the government. Retiring professor in church history, Bernt Oftestad, had a point when he recently held his final lecture at the University of Oslo. He said that Norwegian society is heading towards a totalitarianism fueled by the leftist political elites and the media who attempt to control everyone to think and act just like them. And the leftist elite is quite cunning in the way they have placed their own good friends and allies in leading positions in the state-owned companies and the political structures in Norway. In the aftermath of the Anders Behring Breivik terror, July 2011, it was quite difficult for the Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg to solve the issues around the needed resignation of Norway's Chief of Police Øystein Mæland. This is after the 22nd of July Commission's report. As he was disqualified due to personal relations. The Norway Chief of Police Øystein Mæland was Stoltenberg's best man at his wedding. And the Minister of Justice Grete Faremo was also a close friend of them both. The CEO and the president of the largest Norwegian bank, DNB Nord, Rune Bjerke, is also a very good friend of Stoltenberg and was also his best man. The candidate to mayor of Oslo from Arbeiderpartiet, Libe Riiber-Moen, is the CEO's wife, Rune Bjerke's wife. Norwegian media has reported a large number of affiliations like this throughout the leftist Norwegian political system. The negative sentiments amongst academics and intellectuals has been particularly strong, also partly due to their affiliations with the labor movements, naturally, but also as a larger part as the leftist groups that have gained power in Norway in the aftermath of the 1968 revolution. The use of boycott against Israel when it comes to trade is one of the Palestine Committee's favored actions, which we have seen the past years when, for example, ministers like Kristin Halvorsen in 2006 warned against buying products from Israel, as well as academic and cultural boycotts where Norwegian employees at Norwegian universities refuse to have anything to do with Israeli intellectuals. This is a typical pattern of this. Halvorsen is today Minister of Education and Research in Norway. This form of activism caught international attention during the visit of the renowned Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz last year as he came to Norway in March and was not welcome to hold any lecture at any Norwegian universities. I held the opening speech at the conference Oslo Symposium, where Mr. Dershowitz also was one of the speakers. It has long been known that without the politically correct leftist opinion, one does not easily become a professor at Norwegian universities. Maybe this is why I've been wondering for years why we score so low, Norway, being such a rich country and being so well educated in many ways. How come we score remarkably low on the international evaluations? Maybe because the most brilliant minds are pushed out or choose to live abroad or take other vocations as the radical left dictates on how to think and what to discuss, limits the debate, the intellectual debates in Norway in a grand scale, and thus makes us the losers. On the local level, I've been talking about the state level, I've been talking about the media, we've talked about the universities. We're now on to the local level. Disturbing leading polls, like, for example, the Oslo Municipal Survey 2011, reported that Jew is now the most used cuss word in Oslo schools. Over 50% reported this as the most used filthy word you say to somebody when you want to say they are stupid. 1/3 of the Jewish children in the Oslo school reported they are continuously bullied. We hear a lot in the Norwegian media about the Muslims. There are problems for the Muslims too, because the Norwegian society as a whole has been very unused to different ethnic groups living together. Not like England, many other societies where they have had much more of this due to the colonial period and other historical reasons. Norway has been and still is a very ethnically you can say group, just plain Norwegians. So also a number of the Muslims are experiencing not so good attitudes from the ethnic Norwegians. It's a problem in society. But 1/3 of the Jewish children explained that they felt bullied on a regular basis, but only 5% among the Muslim children reported the same problem. The recent report from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe showed that as high as 38% of Norwegians feel Israeli treatment of Palestinians is equivalent to the Nazi treatment of Jews. When it comes to business and trade, and this is also peculiar, Norway is known for its strong state companies, especially in the oil sector. Here, the same. Leftist current Labour government that advises its companies against helping Israel in its attempt to find oil, sends letters to the private sector and urge Norwegian companies to rush into Libya to aid the Sunni fractions there. The degree of anti-Israelism in Norway today, on state level, in the media, in the trade unions, and at the universities, colleges and schools, is unprecedented in modern Norwegian history and has been highly criticized, amongst others, by the President of Israel, Mr. Shimon Peres. The powerful individuals that have pushed for these solely negative and biased views are today responsible for creating a politically correct hatred towards Israel that today portrays my country internationally as the most anti-Semitic country in the West. I say anti-Israelism is anti-Semitism's new face in Europe. Deep injustice lie in the fact that leading radical leftist opinion makers have decided not to contribute to a balanced view of the Middle East, but only reflect the politically correct left-wing dictate. The biased media thus becomes the source for warmongering instead of a balanced search for peace. Articles create mistrust and hatred instead of leading humankind towards peace. No wonder the misinformed people in countries like Norway interpret what they read in the newspapers as if Israel is an apartheid rogue state. They are isolated and naively believe in what they read in the papers. This responsibility lies with the editors and the political leaders pushing through political ownership like we see in Norway, which denies people the right to hear different views of the so pluralistic stories, so many different stories, and refuse them objective information so that they themselves, this should be an individual right in democracies. I myself should be given the right to choose and decide what to think. During Soviet times, this type of biased information was called propaganda. The same word is often used by philosopher Noam Chomsky, who by the New York Times as well as the Observer is named the world's most important intellectual and the most cited living person in the social sciences and the humanities today. In Necessary Illusions and a number of other books, he talks about the current patterns in the Western media and says that predominantly in Western democracies, even so more than in dictatorships, thought control is very important for the political elite. He believes that in reality the freedom of the press is far more limited in democracies than what people think. The reason is that political authorities in democracies need to control public opinion through the media, as it is the people who go to the voting polls and elect their political leaders. In dictatorships, there is no real need to control the people in that sense, because leadership is appointed by those in power. No one really needs to think too much about what the people think. In the press, Chomsky says, in the West, Chomsky says the press has increasingly become an instrument for Western propaganda that serves as a cover for a reality in which the media is controlled by political ideological elites. The late professor, whom I enjoy very much reading, J.L. Talman of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, has also written extensively about the dangers of democratic states turning into totalitarian democracies. He points out that wherever you find a tough socialistic nation with a great degree of state control, you often see the tendency toward totalitarian structures. And this is my point, where a small but all-powerful political elite dictate and rule how everyone should behave. The famous philosopher Hannah Arendt is known for having talked about this in The Origins of Totalitarianism. She studied the roots of Nazism. Nazi being an abbreviation for National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. And she examined how much evil could be systematized during the Second Wall in modern democratic states, with an emphasis on bureaucratic state control over the population. This has some, not much, but some relevance to today's Norway, because the radical socialism, there are many good things with socialism as a whole. When we look at the different ideologies in the world, and I myself, in many questions and pertaining to many areas, I could say I'm a socialist too, because I really stand behind a number of the issues, leading issues of the socialist movement as well. The protection of the weak, there's a number of things that could be mentioned. So even though I now attack what I call the radical left-wing government in Norway, This must be seen in a historical context, and in a context in the Norwegian sense now. We see a too strong of a political elite and too much power in hands of too few. And this is why I'm drawing on these different explanations. It's not to say that everything is wrong with socialism. Those who see my work in the Norwegian news media, they have read many of my articles. I'm on total line with the most harsh amongst the socialists sometimes. So just to mention that. The world-renowned scientist Samuel Huntington has also written extensively about this in The Clash of Civilization and the Remaking of World Order, that the rich Western countries need to respect other nations' right to determine their own values on their own territory, that the West has no right to dominate the rest in such a way that the only freedom one has is the freedom to think and act according to the standards of the West. The belief that everyone else eventually must be silenced is dangerous and at the heart of totalitarian thinking. The church, the Norwegian church, can serve as a closing, an interesting example, because why has the Norwegian church been so silently and conveniently silent? The example of how the Norwegian state church has been increasingly monitored by the left-wing socialists is particularly interesting. It's an example which it is interconnected with the development in Europe as a whole. Because it has been long known that the conservative force of the church is a major obstacle to the left. As early as 1923, Labour politician and foreign minister Edvard Bull wrote that controlling the teachers of the church, the teachings of the church, demeaning its authority, and voicing ruthless opposition against the authority of the church leaders were major goals for the radical left, as they viewed this conservative institution as its main obstacle to change. In the post-World War era, the church has been increasingly monitored by the government, which tends to be the case in countries dominated by socialist ideology. The past year, ties have loosened, but even the process towards independence is closely administered by the current Labour Party government. Popular topics in which church leaders engage are almost solely politically correct, issues popular with the left, and that often far from touch Christian dogmas. They speak about the environment, oil drilling in the Barents Sea, they speak about climatic change. Following the political pattern after World War II, and as the Israeli Labour Party was in power, the attitudes towards Israel were positive. After the Israeli right wing came into power in the 1980s onward, the predominantly socialist media and political mood changed its view on Israel. So did the bishops, who are appointed by these same political authorities. Instead of rising up, the leadership of the Norwegian church has feebly permitted more or less atheistic, secular church ministers to dictate the teachings of the church and rob it of its ecclesiastical backbone. Theologian Eskil Skjeldal points out that for many years the Norwegian church has followed a state-dictated ideology of inclusion, which seeks to reduce the Christian message to a left-wing humanistic cult. Yet, and here there is some hope, Skjeldal points out that the church's problem does not lie at the grassroots level, but at the politicized top. According to a 2008 study, ISSP, addressing patterns of change in religiosity in Norway, Statistics show that religious faith is not in decline in Norway. Even though only 2% attend church services regularly, 84% of the Norwegian people are associated with religious domination and beliefs. These figures could indicate that Norwegian people's negative view of the politicization of the church makes them go outside of the church room. And a recent survey by Norway's largest newspaper, VG, showed a similar split. And this is interesting when it comes to the question of Israel. A similar split between the political leftist elites and mainstream views among the people when it comes to the question of Israel. Upon asked if they support Norwegian media's chronically negative covering of Israel, with a few exceptions, I must say, it happens that, and that makes us immensely happy because we want a balance. 60% of the Norwegian people felt that the Israeli embassy was right in complaining about the NRK, the state, another state thing, the state news channel in Norway, being highly biased. So 60% of the regular Norwegian people are actually annoyed at the NRK. Even though if we don't read that many international newspapers in Norway, a number of us still do. And it's annoying to read the Norwegian papers and to see how they omit the atrocities done, for example, by Palestinian groups towards Israel. But they always report, and they never miss to report, how Israel then retaliates, or if any mistake is done in Israel, or if there's something going on from the Israeli side towards the Palestinian groups. 60% of the Norwegian people are annoyed at this. Within this group, you also find the quite large segment of the more conservative traditional Christians who support Israel in a deep-rooted belief in the joint Jewish heritage. The radical left has been deeply influenced. There's so many writers. I could mention so many names. I don't do that here today because, but it's very interesting. I've been in my book Alarm, Thoughts on a Culture in Crisis, which was reprinted 5 times in Norway under a year. Has a lot of information on scientists, writers, historians who speak about just this. The radical left, and that says something too. I must say as a parenthesis, that says something. When I've come with these books of mine that really come with a completely different point of view, there's not a news channel in Norway that doesn't want to have my statements on the news. Of course, in a sense, to have a bit of a balance and to give me the way to speak because of that. But also I find a lot. I speak with the leading politicians. We speak with leading scientists at the universities. There's so many people talking to me and supporting some of the push we are trying to do in Norway in order to voice some of the other perspectives. So I think there's a lot more also. The fact that my books sell to this degree too is also pointing in the direction that there's a large group of the Norwegian people who actually enjoy reading something else than what we normally do in the papers. And the radical left has been deeply influenced by the utopian dream of a modern, scientific, unified world, joined together in a global village, where man has finally triumphed over religion and all traditions. This has made the left intolerant and very harsh towards people who think differently than themselves. For example, against conservatives who believe freedom incorporates the individual's right to be different from the majority, thus the need to protect the right of every minority in society. There should be room and respect for Jews, Palestinian Christians, Muslims, gays, unwed mothers, traditional families, and conservative Christians. There should be room for all, not only the favored by the radical left. I believe that were the Norwegian people given a balanced, just information from an informative, objective angle, instead of the dividing, harsh propaganda that has dominated the Norwegian public now for so long, we would see a great change in public opinion. And at the moment, the majority of Norwegians push for political change. In the next election, in 2013, after all, we, the Norwegians, are nice. We want to be perceived as righteous and kind. We want our country to flourish, and we want to invite foreigners so that they too can experience the joy of the beautiful Norwegian woods, the Cape North, the Northern Lights, the deep fjords, named by the National Geographic Society as the #1 place in the world you should see before you die. We want them all to enjoy our fishing villages with salmon, which we export to all the corners in the world. We want you all to taste our world-renowned salted codfish bacalhau, and come as professors, businessmen, tourists and workers to see the green, green farmland and wonderful countryside. And we want change. We want new attitudes in the Norwegian political system and the media. We want to push for more freedom and less biased information about Israel, and a more real and balanced knowledge about the world as a whole, so that Norway and its international reputation can reflect that we want to join the nations in respect for the differences in cultures and in the quest for more peace in our time.